This lecture will look at the rise of imperial Rome, the first emperor, and the Pax Romana, a period of nearly 200 years where we find a very prosperous Rome building massive monuments across their new empire. Specifically, we will look at the Julio-Claudian family and the Flavians, who are going to take over after them. Republican Rome, where we left off, is established and organized logistically as a large city-state, where the form of government is really an oligarchy controlled by a senate, or a series of rich or wealthy families, like the Julii family, for instance, the Colonna and other wealthy families, will be controlled by this elected body of officials and two consuls. This arrangement and organization is feasible within a certain size. However, the empire is growing larger and larger, therefore the government could no longer enforce taxation and maintain order and the basic civil functions that it had promised before. Therefore, power is going to be located in the hands of fewer and fewer until only an emperor, not the Senate, will rule. This corresponds with a swelling of population by the 1st century BCE, where we find over 1 million people living in Rome. This is only made possible through the latest engineering technology, whereby we can bring in from hundreds of miles away fresh water on a daily basis through aqueduct systems. They have a rudimentary sewage system, and even the wealthiest members in Rome could afford to have water piped into their homes, something that we would not see again for over 2 millennia. Now, the vocabulary that we find in the United States, in the Capitol buildings, the White House, any of the justice halls, libraries, or otherwise that are built, are going to be taken from the vocabulary of imperial Rome. We, of course, intended to suggest that we built our country on the republican virtues that came before it, but the massive, impressive monuments really are dedicated to the imperial presence. Now, with the Ides of March 44 BCE, where we left off last time, a civil war follows, and that's going to be pitting the side that assassinates Julius Caesar with Mark Antony and Brutus against Julius Caesar's allies, including his grandnephew and his family, say Octavian. The civil war will last until 27 BCE. This is going to mark the outset and beginning of the Roman Empire. With the early empire and the Julio-Claudians, the families that were going to be ruling at this time in a dynasty passed down from father to son will rule until their death and the Flavians take over, and we will look up until 96 Common Era in this class today. The individual who would come out on top and would take over where his great uncle left off is Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew, who was 19 years old at the time. For the next 17 years, he will vanquish opposition to bring peace to Rome and establish what is then called the Pax Augusta, or the Augustan peace. This prevails for 2 centuries and will become known as the Pax Romana because it moves beyond his reign. During this period, we find emperors are able to, because they are not in constant war, they're able to build roads, bridges, theaters, amphitheaters, bathing complexes all over Europe in their vast territory. They will use their great resources to mold public opinion into understanding and agreeing with their rule, as they are inheriting the right to rule from gods themselves now. In fact, it would be Octavian himself who would begin this trend, changing his name to Augustus, thus giving us the month August in our calendar today. He carries on where his great uncle left off as a great conqueror, for every emperor from now on must do 3 things to be great and respected and loved. One is to be a conqueror and to bring new territories under the flag of Rome. And we find that his territory was Egypt as he conquers Mark Antony, and Cleopatra commits suicide, willing the last Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt to him. Caesar, his great uncle, is going to conquer Gaul, and Vercingetorix, the great Gallic leader, thus bringing France under the control of ancient Rome. In 27 BCE, the Senate will bestow the title princeps upon him, or first citizen, making him what will later be known as a prince in Italian and Latin. However, that is not the extent to the importance of an emperor, for in 12 BCE, he is named Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the state religion, a title still held by the Pope in Vatican City today. This means that he is also responsible for appeasing the gods and sacrificing during high holidays, so he must be a spiritual leader as well. The final thing a Roman emperor must do to be popular is to mold public opinion by building public works projects, specifically those that benefit everyone, like amphitheaters and bathing complexes. Certainly, Augustus does this. Now, because we have a new type of ruler who is no longer defined by age, we have a new image to represent him. And so this will hold true more or less till the end of Rome, where we have a godlike leader who never ages, thus showing us that he is descended from the gods. This is illustrated very clearly, for in the lower left-hand corner here, we find that a tiny Cupid, or son of Venus, is going to point up and tug at Augustus. Here we find that the Julians are going to claim, the family that Augustus comes from, that they are the ancestors of Venus. Here we have Cupid down here reminding us not so subtly that these two men are going to be the same lineage. They both are sons of Venus. To reinforce this idea that the Julio-Claudians and Rome itself is founded by and descended from gods, we know that Augustus is going to commission Virgil, the great Roman poet, to write the Aeneid at this time. The Aeneid is going to pick up, importantly, where Homer's Iliad leaves off, showing us the great struggles of the Trojan peoples as the last prince Aeneas is going to take them to their new home and found Rome. Aeneas, importantly, is going to be the son of Anchises and the goddess Venus. Therefore, the Julio-Claudians trace their lineage back to Aeneas, this founder. Hence, they have a right to rule because they are part god. Here we find, if we compare the portrait Republican leaders to the new Roman emperor, that leadership is no longer defined by age. In fact, we often are going to move radically away from age to a more Greek understanding of idealization, because your power does not come from your experience, but the fact that you are in the lineage of a god. The same treatment is accorded to all the royal family, including his wife, which of course Roman emperors often were related to their wives, just like we looked at back in ancient Egypt. So them looking similarly is not surprising. But here we find the same type of Julio-Claudian idealization, where we find the high cheekbones, the narrow chin, the raised brow, the almond-shaped eyes, the sharp bridge of the nose, all of which are going to be similar in both figures, and including the small pursed lips. However, we know that this is not entirely fictional. It's not entirely idealized and or non-representational, because his chin is cleft, and that is going to be a very specific idiosyncratic marker of Augustan portraiture that we will look at later on when later emperors wish to compare themselves to him. On his cuirass, we are identifying Augustus as a general, hence this is often called the portrait of Augustus as general, because he is wearing a general's chest piece or breastplate, a cuirass. We discussed that last time with the Republican general. On these curiae, we often are going to find images that relate to what the wearer has done, what are their deeds, or what is their family lineage like. Here we are looking at the deed that Augustus carries out and the return of the standards. In 20 BCE, after he became emperor, he went on a diplomatic mission to the Parthians. With victory over them, they returned a standard that was stolen, or a military standard, which in this case is a staff with the eagle of Rome at the top. Here we find the Parthian wearing pants to the right, which of course the Romans thought was hilarious and of course was not a civilized way to dress, is going to be shown bearded, remember the Romans shaved, handing the standard to a Roman soldier or the personification of Roma, or Rome herself. Notice there is a she-wolf at the feet of that figure. Above, we have a celestial deity or a sky god who's going to be holding open a canopy of peace, as we find the chariot of Helios is driven across the sky, and then victories are going to be surrounding him because he is victorious. Below, we find the personification of the earth holds an overflowing cornucopia, showing us that prosperity is going to be made possible thanks to the peace that the Pax Augusta is going to bring, that Augustus brings peace. Thus, of course, it is better for everyone at this time living under Rome's protection. Now, if we compare this figure to earlier popular Greek works that were models for Roman athletes and were copied, again, in several examples that we know of, Polyclitus's Doryphorus is going to be the model for the pose here, specifically of the feet, for we note that Roman emperors often don't show themselves nude. They will show themselves in a particular military guise or in dress to show us that they are great military leaders, but we still want to relate back to the Greek Golden Age and the revival of Greek idealism, as of course he's going to be doing here by modeling himself after earlier works by Pericles and other patrons. If you look at the feet of the two figures, you see what Augustus and his sculptors have adopted from the Doryphorus, and that is the contrapposto pose, where all of the weight is distributed on the right leg, the engaged leg, while the left one is relaxed. However, as we just noted, he is not nude. The pose is going to be taken from the Arringatore or Aula Metelle, the Etruscan full-standing bronze hollow cast that we looked at when we talked about Etruscan art. Here we find that the adlocutio pose, which is an oratorial pose where he's addressing a crowd. So just like the Arringatore, Augustus is here as a model for later emperors talking to us. This is set up in the middle of a piazza or square. So he is addressing us as a godlike ruler. Just like late classical sculpture, we find that he is going to be interacting with us. We can walk around him, but he is talking to us. Therefore, we do not understand the sculpture passively, but instead Roman sculpture is going to adopt that pathos of late Greek art that seeks to engage theatrically with the figures around it. Therefore, Roman eclecticism, bringing together the Greek and Roman and Etruscan ideas of style, subject, and presentation, are used here brilliantly by Augustus in much of his works and much of his commissions as propaganda, showing us that he deserves to be the first emperor. And by and large, he is going to receive very little pushback or resistance from the populace. He is, in fact, a populist ruler. His popularity will spread throughout the empire as he will adopt the same strategies as his great uncle, coining, once again, in mints with this numismatic approach, putting his face on coins to ensure that across the vast empire, everyone knows who he is and what he has done. On the back, very often putting the monuments that he's commissioning that benefit, right, the populace at large. Now, what we must not forget is that these would have been polychromed or brightly painted. They would have been very graphic, and you could read them better at a distance. They, of course, are a bit jarring to modern audiences, but we need to keep this in mind regardless. Now, the Julio-Claudian dynasty would come to an end with the suicide of Nero, a self-indulgent and extravagant megalomaniac who had many of his family members killed, including his mother. He also kicked his pregnant wife to death, and we find the Senate will declare him an enemy of the state in 68 Common Era due to these indulgences, these excesses, and he is forced to commit suicide with the help of a loyal slave. What follows is civil war, a common occurrence we will look at again and again in ancient Rome. The family to come out on top are the Flavians, or the Flavius family. So Vespasian is going to be the patriarch of this family. He is a hard-bitten military ruler who is practically minded. He has 2 sons, so we already have a dynasty established, with Titus and Domitian after him. He restores the imperial finances and stabilizes the frontiers, and establishes a trend that is all too familiar in ancient Rome, whereby when an emperor's family line is severed, the military commanders and generals will race to Rome to claim that they are emperors. We will see this over and over. Now, what Vespasian does first is going to be telling for his rule, trying to distance himself from the megalomaniacal Nero before him. So he takes back private land that was confiscated from the people of Rome after a massive fire decimates downtown. Nero builds a domus aurea, or golden pleasure palace. So Vespasian takes this land back. He is going to destroy, he razes it to the ground, and then builds on top of it a monument for everyone, the Colosseum. The Colosseum is named not for the Flavian family, nor that is an amphitheater, but instead there was a colossus of Nero, nude as a sun god, next to the site. So the nickname is going to be named for the Colossus, hence it is the Colosseum, the amphitheater next to the large statue, literally. Now, in the early Middle Ages, we have a saying that is going to foretell what happens to Rome. For it states that while stands the Colosseum, Rome shall stand. When falls the Colosseum, Rome shall fall. And when Rome falls, the world. Which is true. We find that when Rome falls, the world falls. And the Colosseum stands for the heartbeat of Rome, the populace, and once again a place for everyone to come together and enjoy the largest spectacle of blood sport ever assembled. Now, approaching the Colosseum today from this angle, the north side, we note that we see it relatively intact, even though it is stripped of its marble revetment and veneer. There was unfortunately an earthquake that brought down the opposite section, but the proper title for this structure is in fact the Flavian Amphitheater, because it was built by the Flavian family and it is a double theater. Unfortunately, Vespasian was not alive to see the opening 100 days of games. It was dedicated by the next emperor, his son Titus, in 80 Common Era. At 160 feet tall, this amphitheater would have been the largest ever built, seating over twice what we discussed in Pompeii. Here we have over 50,000 people, which obviously could not fit the million-plus populace of Rome, but is going to be an engineering marvel in and of itself. So the southern side, as you see here, falls in an earthquake in the 9th century in 847. So we find there are newer bricks and newer concrete sections here that reinforce the structure so it will not crumble any further. As we discussed briefly with the amphitheater in Pompeii, gladiatorial combats were the main event, but were certainly not the only activity and or blood sport seen inside of Roman amphitheaters. Here we know that originally they could have flooded the lower section of what would become the hypogeum and have mock sea battles. We also would then bring in the morning animals, these exotic animals from throughout the Roman Empire, from Africa and Asia, showing us the vast extent of Roman power, and then slaughter them. Then, of course, at midday, we would have executions where condemned criminals, whether for political, religious, or heretical reasons need to be executed, would be brought out. Then we could have mythological and military reenactments, where we would show the great battles of seasons and days past of Rome and the Roman soldiers that triumphed. Then finally, at the end of the day, we would get to the prime time event of a gladiatorial combat, which again would not pit them to the death unless they fought poorly and or were not well trained. Now there were several amphitheaters of great size that came before the Colosseum, but this more than doubles the size of any of those previous amphitheaters, especially that in Pompeii that only seats 20,000. Now, we have numbered entrances at the Colosseum that would have led to the cavea, the seating area, which is now missing because the interior and exterior of the Colosseum was quarried for building materials for the peoples in the Middle Ages that come after the Romans. Therefore, we would have seen gleaming white marble throughout the interior here. Like that of Pompeii, Roman amphitheaters seat by way of social hierarchy, and that reflects military hierarchy. The box seats below, as we would understand them, reserved for the emperor and his entourage, and then the wealthy aristocratic or patrician class. Slaves and women would sit all the way at the back. There were 76 gateways, and you would be given a clay tablet with a number on it, so you know which entrance to go into and which is your seat. Reconstructing the Colosseum, just like in Pompeii, we know that it would have been covering by a cloth awning or curtain known as a velarium. These would have been manned by Roman navymen who would be used to working with ropes and pulleys and sails. And so the same process would have, and principles would have ensured that they could raise and lower these awnings as the day progressed to shade different parts of the Colosseum. Originally, we must consider that marble revetment would have covered the exterior, that it was chipped away over time, and you can now see the small, almost termite-looking holes in the side of the building where the iron rods would have inserted or affixed this marble revetment to the surface. Here on the south side that fell down, we get the best indication as to how these amphitheaters are actually built, though. Note that they are a series of almost honeycomb-like overlapping barrel vaults that are very lightweight. They do not take much material, but are very strong. Here in a reconstruction of what the exterior would have looked like, we must imagine that the section of the facade of the Colosseum intact would have been incredibly spectacular, even with a series of sculptures of gods and great athletes that you would see on the inside lining it. Now, each one of these columns is flanked by an arcuated opening, which is definitively a Roman approach to decoration, for it is decorative. It is not functional. It is not structural. So you'll notice that the arcuated opening flanked by attached or engaged columns will be carried on in many other structures we will look at. Here, moving from the lower to the upper section, we notice that the Greek orders are also kept. They are also kept and used in order from the most masculine, the heaviest, and the least decorative at the bottom that carries the most weight, to the androgynous order with Ionic volutes, to finally the feminine order at the top with Corinthian capitals, the most decorative and light. At the very top section, on the fourth level, we have these pilasters that are going to be flattened out, and then we have Corinthian capitals at the top. The Emperor Titus oversaw the opening of the Colosseum, and so not surprisingly, many of the same decorative elements would be used in his monuments after his death. So at death, importantly, Roman emperors, if they are good and popular, are often deified as gods. This, once again, is going to commemorate their accomplishments as they are very often voted a god by the Senate and the people of Rome, and these triumphal arches that are built to commemorate that. Now, upon ascension in 81 Common Era, Domitian is going to commission a triumphal arch to his brother Titus, who has just died, to honor the capture of Jerusalem that he oversaw in 70 Common Era. The Arch of Titus can be seen today as the entryway to the Roman Forum coming from the Colosseum. It is 50 feet tall, made primarily of concrete, and then faced with marble like the Colosseum that it faces. 4-horse chariot or a quadriga would have been on the top surmounting this structure with the emperor riding in the chariot. It says very bravely and very astutely above in this plaque that the Senate and the people of Rome are going to name the god Titus the son of the god Vespasian. Here we have a reconstruction of what many of these monuments would have had on them. Later civilizations, importantly, are going to break these down and melt them down for their composite alloys. So the inscription, of course, is going to honor the god Titus, the son of the god Vespasian. Thus, both are going to be deified at their death. Here, with the Triumphal Arch, we have engaged columns framing these arcuated openings, a purely decorative element, for the columns do not hold up the structure. It is held up by the concrete that is going to be on the interior. But we still find this decorative element to be appreciated by the Romans, and they're actually going to add to, append to the Greek orders. For the Romans are going to adopt the Greek orders of Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, but add to that the Tuscan Doric, the Roman Doric, and the composite order. The composite order, importantly for the Romans, is going to show that they are an eclectic people, and so their style is equally eclectic. This is where we throw together or combine Ionic volutes with Corinthian acanthus leaves. So these composites going to be found on the side, where the spandrels are going to hold victories. Victorious over what? Well, if we walk through this triumphal arch, which shows us the emperor was triumphant, we find two reliefs on either side as we're moving through. They move through in the same direction. Here we have a parade where Titus is going to move down the sacred way, showing us the end of the conquest of Judea, or the end of the Jewish wars, where he crushes a revolt in Palestine in 70 Common Era. We identify the spoils of war brought back from this campaign, and specifically, this is very common for the Romans, record the ethnographic objects that are associated with different cultures. Often it's the only way we know certain cultures dressed and or looked a certain way. Here we have a menorah, for instance, as they move in very high relief, casting deep shadows from the left to the right in this very loud procession, moving through a triumphal arch with a 4-horse quadriga on it, as though they're walking through this very triumphal arch that we are walking through. Thus, we are reenacting this triumph of the Romans over the Jewish people. Now, both of these record actual events, such as the Areopagus Augusti and the Arch of Titus here, but because the Arch of Titus is in high relief, we get the essence communicated of much more exuberant action. Dramatically, we find these figures seem to be moving in a much more effective fashion, that it seems louder, and it seems as though that they are moving much more quickly. Low relief, as you note here, survives better and more intact, but it does not convey that sense of urgency that can be seen in high relief sculpture. On the opposite side, we have the triumph of Titus, and the first time in which we have a living person or a mortal shown with allegories. So these allegorical figures, or the personifications of ideas or concepts, are going to show us the characteristics that Titus is associated with. So instead of showing him in battle, fighting some foreign foe, and or being magnanimous, we're going to show the figures that represent that. Figures such as these imperial virtues, like valor, honor, and then victory behind him. He's in a 4-horse quadriga, a 4-horse chariot that would be seen above on top of this triumphal arch. He's crowned by victory while valor leads his horses. He is honorable, so honor is next to him as well. Allegories are common in Roman art and used before, but never for fully propagandistic purposes. This is going to be for propaganda now. Thus, we have for the first time showing a mortal in a narrative relief engaging with and interacting with these massive figures, these allegorical figures, such as victory, that will crown someone victorious, shown much like the goddess Nike flying behind him. Therefore, this is not offensive, we must remember, because Titus was already deceased when this was commissioned. Claiming to be a god while one is alive is heretical, and this is why it leads to the death of many Roman emperors, including Caligula. This lecture will look at the apex of Roman power as it spreads all the way up to the UK, through modern-day Romania and pushing on the boundaries of Germania. This leads us into the High Empire, following what we looked at last time with the Flavians. And, as with the Flavians, the military-minded emperor of Vespasian, so too will we find repeated reference to military rulers and competency in the High Empire, where rulers will, one after another, adopt their chosen successor instead of giving the right to rule to their sons. This is a very successful strategy that only ends in 192 Common Era with the death of Commodus, because an emperor did not adopt a competent ruler and instead gave it to his son. The emperor that establishes this new tradition of adopting their heirs is Trajan. So we will look now at the 2nd century while Rome is at its peak, extending all the way up to England, all the way over to modern-day Romania across the Danube River, and pushing on the Rhine River and the boundaries between Rome and Germania. Now, Trajan is going to hail from Italica Hispania, or southern Spain. He will be the governor of Upper Germany, or Germania, and he will choose his successor Hadrian, as will Hadrian choose his successors, the Antonines. Already demonstrating his competence as a ruler, serving as a Roman general, being born in Italica, Spain, and governing Upper Germany, he will be significantly the first non-native Italian ruler to be brought to Rome to become the next emperor. He establishes his reputation relatively early on by establishing far-reaching social, governmental, and military reforms. Thus, he will be granted by the Senate the title Optimus, or the best. In the late antiquity, his popularity is known, for senators who would hail a new emperor would wish them that they be felicitor Augusto melior Traiano, or luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. Hence, they are linked in the late antique mind, these two great popular emperors. In commissions for monumental portraits of himself, Trajan would very self-consciously associate himself with Augustus, showing himself with the same pose, dress, position, and sometimes even similar facial features. In the Forum Romanum, or Roman Forum, the heart of the Roman Empire, where we find several important basilicas, temples, and, of course, the crossroads of ancient Rome overlooking the Colosseum, we know he also associates himself with Augustus, given his chosen location and shape of his forum. Built with the spoils of war from Dacia, or modern-day Romania, we know that the Forum of Trajan was incredibly impressive. Visitors marveled at the expense and the engineering prowess that would have taken to build it. He brought Apollodorus of Damascus, this Greek, who was also an outsider, to Rome as his civil engineer because he had been his military engineer on campaign in Romania. The work of Apollodorus must have been impressive, for in 357, when the new Emperor Constantine visited Rome, he stopped in his tracks astonished, marveled at Trajan's forum, and stated, which cannot be described with words, and could never again be attempted by mortal men. In the Forum, we would enter, much like later Christian basilicas, into an atrium or courtyard, where there would have been an equestrian portrait of Trajan. This leads us to the Basilica Ulpia, or a basilica or law court, then the Column of Trajan, flanked by libraries, until we finally get to the temple to the deified Trajan. The location of the Forum of Trajan is going to be significant because it is right next to and in the same shape of the Forum of Augustus. So in his location, he is still trying to associate himself with this early, popular, good emperor. In the Forum, we have an additional basilica with exedrae and/or these apses that come out to the side, just like we find in the Forum of Augustus. Then, behind it, we have libraries and the Column of Trajan, the only part to survive from this Forum. And then finally, after his death and deification, there was a temple built to the new god Trajan behind it. Here is the Forum of Trajan today. Obviously, the columns surrounding it give you an indication of the scale and complexity of the structure. But the only object to remain intact is the Column of Trajan in the center here. Now, the column is 128 feet tall. Today, it has an image of St. Peter surmounting it. Originally, we have coins that show us a nude statue of Trajan originally is going to surmount this massive column. Popes in the 16th century replaced it with an image of the first Pope, or St. Peter. Hence, we find that Christianity is going to become the inheritor of ancient Rome. The statue that would have originally surmounted it is in a long line and tradition of heroic nude portraits that were common among leaders going back to the Hellenistic age. We find the Colossus of Nero, another example that we discussed last time. At the base of the column, we find Trajan's tomb as he was cremated. It is decorated in low relief with Dacian arms and armor to show us the peoples that he conquered, and also in that Roman ethnographic tradition to record what they looked like, so that we have a record of these ancient peoples that were defeated by the Romans. Now, the column itself is the first of its kind, yet is going to be illustrating series of historical and military events that took place during the conquest of Dacia in a 625-foot band that rotates lower left to upper right all the way around this column. But it merely illustrates the scenes like scrolls in the neighboring libraries, for they do not adopt codices yet until late antiquity. Instead, the books of the day would have been rolled around two scrolls on each side and then unfurled as you need to read it left to right. Now, they're going to indicate that we are carrying on this tradition that we discussed before with Lars Poulena, in which we lay out one's events or one's conquests. And they also are like painted military campaigns that would be carried in processions and or on coins. The episodes on the Column of Trajan glorify Trajan as a military leader who was at every important stage of this campaign. There were two said campaigns against the Romanians, or the Dacians as the Romans called them. There are over 150 individual episodes on the column that spiral upwards and over 2,500 figures. Now at the bottom we have a fairly low relief, assuming that the viewer can get close to it and thus can discern what is happening relatively easily. Now at the bottom we begin with the river god representing the Danube, showing us where we are in reference to geography. So we are beginning at the Danube River. At the time, that is what divided the Roman Empire from the Dacians. Trajan then leads his army out of a city and then across this river, thanks to the engineering prowess of Apollodorus of Damascus, his military engineer and his architect for the forum in which we now stand looking at this. Now we know that the Romans were successful in battle not because they fought most of the time, but because they prepared. They build siege equipment, they build army camps, they are going to dig in building trenches, they prepare building catapults. Thus, of course, fighting takes up a very minimal amount of each military campaign. As we move to the upper sections of the Column of Trajan, we notice that the bands increase in height and they are going to be more deeply undercut. Thus, they are no longer the very shallow, low relief as we see in the lower sections. So the artists and the sculptors knew that it would be difficult to see far up into the air, over 100 feet, what is happening. So they tried to increase the graphic nature, much like the effects of sunken relief in Egypt, as much as they could. The column can be compared to the Palette of Narmer from pre-dynastic Egypt, whereby each is technically an historical fiction, showing us events that people would be familiar with from coins and then processional paintings. But in fact, this is not what transpired. We do not have the emperor at each one of these scenes. They are stock imagery, if you will, of military campaigns, not showing us exactly what happened in Dacia. Following Trajan, Hadrian will be his chosen successor and fellow Spaniard, whom he adopts again as a middle-aged man, carrying on this idea that Roman emperors should prove themselves as capable administrators before taking power. Now, we know that Hadrian admired Greek culture quite a bit, so much so that he's known as a Philhellenic, or a Greek-loving Roman. He's even called Graculus for being the Greekling. Hadrian's love of Greek culture extended beyond his admiration for their art and architecture. He even grew a beard for his affinity to the mature portraits in classical Greece, such as those by Pericles, showing us the ideal mature warrior. He will be so popular that every Roman emperor after him until Constantine will also grow a beard. Now, we know that more portraits than any other emperor outside of Augustus are going to survive of Hadrian. This shows us how popular he was. Thus, we find that emperors will emulate him after Hadrian. One of the most important structures that Hadrian commissions is the rebuilding of the Pantheon, which existed and had burned down. That's why Marcus Agrippa's name is on the facade of this very famous and best surviving building from antiquity. The Pantheon is named All Gods, for it is dedicated to the 7 planetary deities, or those planets that they could see, including Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, etc. Inside there were 7 niches with over life-size statues of these 7 planetary gods. Hence the shape of the structure you can see here from above is a sphere. That's what the building is designed around, with a standard pseudo-peripteral Roman temple front appended to the front. In its original state, it would have had a piazza or plaza out front with an open-air colonnade. Also, we would have had gold gilding on the exterior and the facade, as well as bronze rosettes in the coffering in the center. Beyond that, a lot of the original colored marble does in fact survive, which is what makes the Pantheon so unique and so impressive to the Christians of the Middle Ages and the architects of the Renaissance. Now, on the facade, we find on the entablature, we have in Latin spelled out, this is Agrippa's Pantheon. Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, built during his 3rd consulate. It was destroyed in a fire of 80 Common Era. Thus, he reconstructs the original text here, also showing that he is not as megalomaniacal as earlier emperors, and also points to the reason why he's so popular. The temple front, as you're walking up to the Pantheon, is standard and derived from the ancient Greeks. Specifically, Hadrian had traveled all around the Roman world and had seen the Parthenon. Therefore, this is an octa-style temple with 8 columns out front. That is distinct and relates to the Parthenon. On the inside, we see that the Pantheon is a concentric sphere, 142 feet in diameter. So you find that it stands up and/or the ceiling, this hemispherical dome, is supported by solid concrete with 20-foot thick walls at the base forming this drum. We find that as we move up to the upper section, we alleviate or eliminate much of the weight by adding pumice and or more lightweight aggregate to the concrete mixture. The oculus is going to, of course, allow light into the structure and ventilation, much like a chimney, but it also relieves the weight, distributing the weight of the dome back down to the drum instead of in the center where the oculus would be. Thus, the effect is unlike anything else known in the world and is envied by architects and civilizations hereafter. For we have a unified interior that is uninterrupted by supports. And we can see this unified spherical understanding in this structure that celebrates the 7 planetary deities. Hence, this would have been reinforced earlier with bronze rosettes or stars gleaming in the coffering in the ceiling. So here we have the original colored marble that survives from antiquity because the Pantheon was converted to a Christian church very early on in Christianity's legalization and history. So the separate niches are dedicated now to saints and not to Roman gods. The plan of the Pantheon illustrates its difference from that of its Greek predecessor. We do not have columns supporting the structure in the center like a hypostyle hall all the way back to Egypt and Karnak. Instead, the structure supports itself by a drum, this circular drum that surrounds the interior walls. We find that there is not one cult statue, but 7 here dedicated to 7 different gods. Therefore, the symbolism inherent in the Pantheon should be apparent at this point, because it represents the orb of the earth and the dome of the heavens. It represents the cosmos as above us. The hemispherical dome represents heaven and/or the stars and bodies in the sky. We occupy the central section in the notion we inherited from the Greek cosmos, this flat area in the middle, and below us, completing the sphere, is going to be Hades or Tartarus. At his death, not surprisingly, Hadrian, given his popularity, is going to be proclaimed a god by the Senate. One of the co-emperors that commissions that anti-classical pedestal is Marcus Aurelius. He ruled alongside Lucius Verus until Verus's death in 169, when Aurelius will rule by himself until 180. He is the last of the 5 good emperors and is a Stoic philosopher, otherwise known as the philosopher emperor. He breaks very radically with the classical conventions of his predecessors, and his portraits are going to reveal the character associated with the emperor. This will become the model for the late imperial portraits. In what would become one of the most influential and famous equestrian statues in all of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we give you the surviving bronze holocast equestrian monument of Marcus Aurelius. Standing 11 feet 6 inches high, we have an example here that is very rare, very unusual. We find that it survived being melted down like all of the other bronze portraits of emperors in the Middle Ages because it was mistaken for a portrait of Constantine. So we know that Roman emperors and/or the Holy Roman Emperor in the Middle Ages, as well as popes and other rulers, when they would have an equestrian monument commissioned, they would reference this one here. With the larger-than-life size bronze with a small-headed horse, the rider is larger so that we can actually read who the individual is. They are the primary subject here, not the horse. The horse, importantly, will always represent the populace that a ruler is going to be in charge of, showing us how powerful he is if he can control that unruly beast. Below him, we have a suggested cowering enemy that Marcus Aurelius is granting clemency to and/or not condemning to death. The gesture, again taken from the late classical era of Greece, is going to engage with us in front of this monument with the emperor towering over us, and also revealing something about his character. Like his other portraits, we realize that Marcus Aurelius is going to reveal the strain of warfare in his portraits. He is often shown as weary, saddened, and/or worried, showing us this is the beginning of the end for classical art. We no longer have perfectly self-assured rulers who feel no fear, pain, and/or weariness. This lecture looks at the downfall of ancient Rome, beginning with the Severans and ending with Constantine moving the capital of Rome to Constantinople. The late empire lasts from 193, the death of Commodus, to 337, when we find this new capital of the eastern part of the empire is going to be established and will still remain the capital for Byzantium until 1453. The Roman Empire that was inherited by the late imperial emperors is going to be one on the brink of collapse. By the time we reach Hadrian and the High Empire, the expansive borders of the Roman Empire were impossible to guard, and so they began hiring the tribes on the borderland, such as the Germans that we have here, the Goths that they were called, to police themselves. That eventually we find they cannot sustain this huge expansive empire. Commodus is going to be assassinated, bringing the Antonine dynasty to an end. The philosopher emperor's son had been the first in centuries to rule, being the blood relative of an emperor. Before him, we find emperors are going to adopt these very well and accomplished rulers to become emperor. Now with Commodus, we have a megalomaniacal ruler that displays the same character flaws as Nero and Caligula. But regardless, Commodus is going to inherit an empire that is already in decline. The economy is declining, the frontiers are rebelling, the bureaucracy that governs ancient Rome is disintegrating, and the official state religion, which was polytheistic, placing the emperor at the head of this religion, is losing ground to Eastern mystery cults, such as Mithraism and Christianity. This undermines the authority of the Roman emperor and the entire structure the Roman emperor is and the empire is built around. This leads us to the late empire, where all of these various religious, economic, and political issues come to a head. With the assassination of Commodus, we have another civil war, as always follows the end of a dynasty. Remerging from the civil war is Septimius Severus, who will found the next dynasty known as the Severans. He is an African-born general that, like Vespasian and Trajan before him, is a hard-bitten, rational military man. He establishes a dynasty that will last a half a century and is going to ensure stability continues by claiming to be the son of Marcus Aurelius, hence continuing that dynastic tradition. He even shows himself with portraits like that of Aurelius, with the long hair and beard of his Antonine father. Specifically, Aurelius grew his hair and beard longer to associate himself with philosophers instead of soldiers. The shorter cropped haircut is going to be demanded by Roman soldiers so that enemies cannot grab onto it. So in this very elongated and exaggerated spiraling beard and longer curly locks that require drill work to produce, he is trying to continue the tradition from the Antonines. In his only preserved painted portrait, here we have the family, the Severans, including the empress, the emperor, and their two sons, painted in tempera or using egg yolk. The family shown here includes his wife Julia Domna, the daughter of a Syrian priest, as well as their sons Geta and Caracalla. He reveals his age, that Septimius Severus does, by showing gray hair and how he is associated and close to his Antonine father Marcus Aurelius. Looking carefully at the painted family portrait, one notices fairly quickly that there is an aberration. One of the sons' faces has been erased, literally. We know that later on, Caracalla would have his brother and his brother's wife murdered. Now, this, of course, is standard practice among royal families to ensure that the offspring of his brother could not challenge his right to rule, nor his son's right to rule. He also had the Senate damn his memory. This is known in ancient Rome as damnatio memoriae, or the damnation of memory. Now, the idea of chiseling someone's face off of monuments and striking through their names in official records is not new. We have record of it going back to Mesopotamia and Egypt, to where unpopular rulers like Hatshepsut and Akhenaten are going to have their statues destroyed. However, the Romans developed this into a political tool and are going to systematize the practice. They have entire bureaucratic offices dedicated to destroying someone's memory. After taking over and becoming the undisputed heir to the Roman throne, we find that Caracalla is going to reveal in his portraiture his suspicious character. So carrying on that tradition from Marcus Aurelius, many of these late imperial portraits will reveal the psychological disposition, fear, anxiety, and or suspicion of these figures. We find that in this portrait, Caracalla radically turns off to look over his shoulder to his left. Now, for us, we see this as an obvious forecast and foretelling that he will be assassinated in his 6th year of his reign, as many as dozens that will be assassinated in the 3rd century, leading into the soldier emperor period. Still, this continues that approach that Marcus Aurelius had used in his portraits, where we reveal something of the character of Caracalla. Note, of course, that his hair is cut short, as is his beard, showing us that he is not associating himself with the philosopher type of Marcus Aurelius, but instead with the soldier type. For on his deathbed, Caracalla's father had told him to mind the soldiers and pay them first. So he associates himself with the soldiers. Now, in the gesture looking off around his shoulder, we might see that as suspicious, but obviously he is attempting to convey a powerful persona here, revealing his character of a hard-bitten military man's son. In the capital, Caracalla very rightly is going to curry favor with the public, just as had earlier emperors such as the Flavians when they built the largest amphitheater, the Colosseum. So too would Caracalla build the largest bathing and recreational complex in Rome. The so-called Baths of Caracalla are going to leave a lasting reminder and impression on the cityscape of Rome, its towering 140-foot tall walls still standing today. The brick-faced concrete is going to be 50 acres in total and could accommodate 1,600 bathers at a time. An immense structure, and it was not only for bathing. The entire structure and complex would have been a small city, taking into account it has recreational areas to bathe, to steam, to exercise, it has tennis courts, it has libraries, audience halls, lecture halls, and then of course gardens surrounding this entire complex. The baths themselves in the center are going to be symmetrical, organized along a central axis, and are going to reveal the Roman penchant and custom of bathing, first in warm water, or the tepidarium, then hot water, the caldarium, and then finally cold water, the frigidarium, in these baths. So after going through the process of each one of these pools and sitting in them, you could then get out and dry off and enjoy any of the other numerous educational and or athletic activities possible here. The concrete drum would have been circular at the center of this chamber and was taller than that of the Pantheons and almost as large. An impressive open interior space it would have been indeed. But that was not the only part of the Baths of Caracalla. There were these sculpted and landscaped gardens, lecture halls, libraries, exercise courts, or swimming pools, all of which in this massive complex which was free to the public, but however was run in an underground area by slaves, literally showing us the division of Roman labor and civilization. Here we have a cutaway of the structure with these lavish sculptures, including the Farnese Hercules and other statues of gods, inspiring vigorous exercise in those in attendance. The walls, of course, are still very impressive, and we have, inspiring a later basilica here, these side aisles, which are barrel-vaulted chapels. Here we have the copy of the Farnese Heracles by Glycon of Athens, which was commissioned specifically for this location to inspire vigorous exercise so that we would look like Hercules upon finishing our exercise regimen and routine. The original appearance of the Baths of Caracalla can be divined by looking at the frigidarium that survives from the Baths of Diocletian in a church. That's similar in the decoration with the colored marble, the composite capitals, the immense groin vaulting and clear lighting, and/or the fenestrated sequence of groin vaults that would let in light to this large interior space that spared no expense in order to ensure Caracalla's legacy would be cemented in history. Unfortunately, Caracalla would be assassinated, bringing the Severan dynasty to an end. The last, of course, of the family being Severus Alexander. What followed is a half-century of civil war, longer than the previous civil wars that we discussed that led to the Flavians or the Severans taking over. At this time, the period of the soldier emperors, we have general after general declared emperor by their troops and then being murdered, usually by the Praetorian Guard. Only architectural projects would be commissioned at this time, and in fact the only one is a new defensive wall around the capital, showing us how much Roman power has decayed. Now they're not only concerned about protecting the borders of Rome, but the very capital city itself. That being, they're worried that all of these various barbarian tribes and hordes are going to make their way down and sack the city. At this time, soldier emperors did not have the luxury to have long-term plans and large-scale commissions. Most of them only had enough time to mint coins to pay their troops, stamping their effigy on it in profile so that people would know who they were, like Trajan Decius here. So each new ruler would set up portraits as quickly as they could because they knew they could be assassinated as well. Now, Trajan Decius is known in the Bible for persecuting Christians. However, here he is not shown as some menacing figure that is in power, that is hunting down this new sect of Christianity. Instead, he looks like a sad old man, here racked with nervous anxiety. And even though this is carved in marble, it looks as though it was modeled in pliant clay. We find that he looks nervous and he looks anxious. Just as we're revealing the character with Caracalla, we now do not show a figure who is going to be steadfast and sure in his decisions. Instead, it is in line with the world weariness and the war weariness as seen earlier in the Middle Kingdom portraits of pharaohs and/or the portraits of Marcus Aurelius. This will give way to a new solution and division of Rome that would avoid these assassinations. For Rome would be divided in 284 Common Era into Western and Eastern halves. The emperor who would come up with this solution, Diocletian, restored order by sharing power with his rivals. In 293 Common Era, he established the tetrarchy, or rule by four, whereby he set himself up as an Augustus, or main emperor of the East, and then there is an Augustus of the West. Then we have Eastern and Western Caesars. Basically, he sets up a set of rulers that would be a president and vice president. So when the president is going to retire, the vice president can then take his place and then bring in another vice president. This allegiance is cemented through the marriage between their daughters. So they divorce their current wives and marry each other's daughters to ensure that they are going to be family at this time and would not dare betray each other or attack one another. The tetrarchy is not going to last long, disintegrating in 305 Common Era, but this division of the Roman Empire remains. To this day, we still have the division between Eastern and Western Europe. The best example of portraiture from the tetrarchic period does not come from Rome or Constantinople. In fact, it comes from St. Mark's in Venice, because off to the side, in a part of Spolia attached to the facade, we have the portraits of the four tetrarchs, shown here as a series of purple or porphyry marble that are going to show them as undistinguishable, as once again together, identically clad in this type of concord. They each are going to have their right arm around the other's shoulder with their left hand on their swords below. Now, they are shown as iconic or anti-naturalistic. They are not trying to show who these individuals were nor what they looked like. They are not individualizing them. Instead, we have a conventional or formulaic style that is very self-consciously avoiding naturalism in order to convey that there is something here that is universal or unchanging. So with the large cubical heads and squat bodies, we are showing each one of the figures as identical, so we do not differentiate them. All four have the same power and the same authority. Therefore, the schematic drapery, the shapeless bodies, are going to suggest not what they looked like, but what the idea of an emperor is. Even their faces are now going to become emotionless masks. They are not racked with anxiety or fear like the soldier emperors. They are above that. Though the tetrarchy would not last long, the stylistic innovations that go along with how they show themselves will be long-lasting indeed, thanks to this next emperor, Constantine the First, nicknamed Constantine the Great, who was the Caesar of the West, but then invaded Italy in 312, and at the Battle of Milvian Bridge defeated his Augustus, Maxentius, taking the capital. He attributed his victory to the Christian God, and hence will legalize Christianity and then make it the official religion of the Roman Empire. He erects an arch right next to the Colosseum, and in between that and the Forum, right at the heart and the crossroads of Rome, so everyone would see this new tripartite arch, which is larger than any we've discussed thus far. In the inscription at the top, it is going to state that he defeated the tyrant Maxentius and thanks this divinity, who remains unnamed, for this victory. This is the first monument that is going to be erected that celebrates a victory of a Roman over another Roman. And because much of downtown Rome is still occupied by the pagans that worship the polytheistic Roman religion, Constantine is going to do a nod of the hat to Christianity, but cannot publicly embrace it as of yet. Testifying to the state in ancient Rome and the lack of resources, every block of this arch was reused from earlier buildings, monuments, and even other triumphal arches. That is spolia. We are reusing material for a new appropriated reason and context. Now, he did not just select any monuments, nor is he going to associate himself with just any emperor. In fact, if you look at those that he selected, taking from Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, each one of these are known as good emperors. So he wants to associate himself with these earlier good emperors. So when he selects an image and does not change it at all, like the largesse of Marcus Aurelius, we are seeing that he's going to be associating himself with the giving of alms to the poor as earlier great emperors had, like the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius. Here, we have a standard classical example of a relief with differentiated people, individuals down here, a mature man, a young woman, a child. All are going to be below, stair-stepping upward and back into space, where Marcus Aurelius and his entourage are, dropping money down to those individuals below. Turning to the same scene that Constantine's artists will carve for him, we have a very different style. This style is known as the late antique style, which is, by definition, very iconic and anti-naturalistic. It does not attempt to show us what these individuals looked like, nor to show individuals at all. Instead, here we have the same division between people below receiving money from the emperor and his retinue, his entourage above. But now all of the figures are the same. In a cookie cutter-like fashion, they have the same facial hair, the same expression and dress. Therefore, we are not trying to show a group of individuals. This is a crowd communicating the idea that is the essence here. That is, Constantine is forever going to be magnanimous and charitable, not showing what it would have looked like, but the idea behind it is paramount. This new set of values, which is a rigid formality and an iconic presentation, will supplant the classical notion of the picture window, thus paving the way for iconic art of the Middle Ages and Christian art. Turning to Constantine's own portrait for his own basilica, which was not a religious structure, we have the monumental remnants of his own approach and take on tetrarchic portraiture. Originally, this image would have been seen as a monumental seated statue of Constantine in the guise of Jupiter, and in fact it's modeled after Jupiter, as in his left hand he would have held the orb, much like Marcus Aurelius in his equestrian monument. The whole of the statue would not have been expensive marble or gold, but instead it would have been a brick core with a wooden torso covered with bronze and a head and limbs made of marble. Much like what we talked about with the statue of Athena in the Parthenon. It also is a wood and brick core with ivory and gold on the exterior. The nervousness that we saw earlier in the soldier emperors is now gone, supplanted and replaced by this frontal mask we often find with tetrarchic portraiture. These enormous eyes, the broad and simple planes of the head, do not communicate what Constantine looked like. Instead, it communicates the permanence that is going to be suggested by his imperial presence, the power that he holds in his hand as he's literally holding the globe. We, of course, dare not try to assassinate him or attack him, for he is God-like, showing himself like Jupiter here. Now, the idea of something being iconic versus idealized can be illustrated thusly. Here we have the rather anti-naturalistic or iconic features of Constantine, whose eyes are much too large. His brow, his, once again, head is too narrow, too flat. And then we find that his other proportions also are not going to be idealized. The portrait of Augustus shows us the same basic features, proportions, and ratios of a human head and skull. We just remove any of the imperfections that would have existed. He is a perfected version of himself here. This statue would have sat monumentally in the apse of his Basilica Nova, or the Basilica of Constantine, which was 300 feet long and 215 feet wide, and whose dimensions would be the model for the first Christian cathedral we will discuss after coming back from the exam. Here, aside from the Baths of Diocletian, we have the largest building in the capital in a century and the first basilica completed in the city since that of Trajan as part of the Forum of Trajan. Originally, it would have had gleaming colored marble in the coffering, on the floors, in the columns, with composite order capitals, all in this fenestrated sequence of groin vaults, letting light in through the second story above. The Baths of Caracalla would have been the direct precedent and would have been the model for the architects working for Constantine to have as a touchstone. The plans are in fact based on those of the Baths of Caracalla, and we can see in the surviving 3 side chapels or barrel vaulted sections that are coffered that they are in fact modeled on those massive barrel vaults that we find in the Baths of Caracalla. Here we have the plan showing you as well the symmetrical understanding that the architects would have referenced. But the Basilica Nova does not survive intact. To see what it would have looked like originally, we must turn to another commission by Constantine. In the capital in the north, where he was stationed originally at Trier, Constantine is going to create the Aula Palatina, which was a basilica that was converted into a Christian church now. Now, the basilicas in ancient Rome are perfect models for the first Christian churches because of what they do and how they are designed. They are audience halls designed to fit as many people inside as possible and to elevate a platform at the end so we can look at one person speaking. Usually that person is arguing a legal case, but for Christianity, you could replace them easily with a preacher. The terminology in these basilicas also will be important for early Christianity, for we have a rectangular nave, named as such because in Latin it is nave, or a ship, so because it looked like a ship turned upside down. This is where the congregation is going to stand. We also have side aisles, which can be used for burial chapels or smaller services. We enter at the very outset through a narthex, or an atrium, and then we focus our attention on a semicircular protrusion or apse, usually elevated on a platform with a podium for someone to speak. This class introduces early Christian and Jewish art in the time period that overlaps with the last late Empire lecture that we covered. In fact, by the time Constantine made it to Rome and overthrew Maxentius, Christianity was already in every major Roman city in the world that they knew of at the time, and would spread to all of the existing Roman Empire by 600 Common Era. It is at this time we find monotheism replacing polytheism, or a belief in one God replacing a belief in many. Throughout all of human history, in fact, it was most common for civilizations to worship more than one god, generally in charge of the different aspects of nature, whether it be the sea, the sky, the earth, or different parts of living. Now, monotheism is going to come from Zoroastrianism and spread through the Jewish tradition, and in turn influenced Akhenaten for his monotheistic religion in Egypt. In turn, early Jewish traditions are going to pass it on to Christianity. Hence, early Christian and Jewish art is going to be Roman in style, but very different in subject and function. We find that this late antique style, developed around the time of Constantine, becomes the early Christian style. Not surprisingly, the same artists that are called upon to produce work for Roman emperors to make polytheistic imagery of the Greek and Roman gods, such as Jupiter, Apollo, would also be called on to make the earliest images of Christianity and Christ himself. This will form the foundation of art in the Middle Ages that is not intended to be representational, but instead is iconic and anti-classical. The earliest remnants of early Jewish and Christian art can be found around the 3rd century in Dura Europos, which is considered to be the Pompeii of the desert. This Roman outpost would be abandoned after it was captured by the Sasanians in 256 Common Era. Leaving it intact, we have over a dozen cult buildings here, both monotheistic and polytheistic, speaking to the range of various traditions and religions that coexisted, especially in the modern-day Middle East. Before religions are adopted and are then sponsored by the state, they begin with private house worship in which they will convert domiciles to religious functions, such as the synagogue seen here at Dura Europos in Syria. Now, in a synagogue, we find that unlike Roman art and Greek art, the Jews do not allow religious imagery to be shown, especially that of God. They prohibit graven images and only show Yahweh as hands and the top of panels, and his presence is going to be assumed. This is going to be the second commandment that prohibits graven images. In synagogues, we will often find a niche, which will be very important and influential for the development of mosques here shortly. But in the niche, we very often find Torahs, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books in the Old Testament, a holy place to enshrine them. Next to this shrine, we have an image that we will use to illustrate the stylistic approach to early Jewish art. Here in Samuel Anoints David, we have an image that is considered late antique and/or anti-classical. For the prophet Samuel here anoints the future king of Israel while his 6 older brothers look on. However, they all look identical except for one that has a beard. Their facial features, their eyes, nose, and mouths, as well as their complexion, are all identical. Notice that each one holds their left hand to their sash and their right hand up as though taking an oath. Through the hierarchy of scale, we find that the prophet is the largest, but we still are continuing that style that is devoid of action, that has stylized gestures and is expressionless, lacking volume and shadow. For we do not know where they are in space if they were not overlapping. There do not cast shadows at their feet, and there is no setting. There is no background or horizon line, for instance. They're going to be positioned in frontal rows, facing forward, just like what we saw with Constantine's arch. The hieratic scaling is also going to take us back to an earlier tradition where the larger figures are seen to be more important. Hence, the prophet is more important than these figures here. David is going to be picked out, importantly, wearing purple, which at the time people would recognize as a color of royalty, for Roman emperors wore purple, a very expensive dye. For the first centuries of the existence of Judaism and Christianity in the Middle East, the organization is going to be largely loose and varied. There are no systematic rituals that are carried out. They are in fact fluid, following local patterns of interpretation. Therefore, there is no special need for architecture at this time. A simple triclinium or dining room in a house, which is the largest room, would suffice for the worship of Christians. Here we have a private residence that was remodeled, just like that seen in the synagogue a moment ago, and this could hold 70 people at a time, more than enough for the small congregation at Dura Europos. Here we find the walls would have been decorated with fresco, and we have this baptismal font that is retrofitted into the side of this niche. Therefore, we have modest second-hand domiciles that are going to be the meeting places for early Christians outside of Rome, for we lack state approval. This does not mean that there is not art relating to Christianity in Rome. It just is going to arrive a century later. At this time, Diocletian is going to arrange for a new round of persecutions in 303 to 305 due to the growing popularity of Christianity among the army and showing that it had spread to the capital city as well. Through political pragmatism, we find these emperors were forced to persecute Christians because this new cult would not worship the Roman state's official gods. That included the deified emperors. This undermined the government as such and undermined the emperor's absolute authority as Pontifex Maximus, or the chief priest of the state religion. The earliest early Christian art in Rome, therefore, comes from the end of the 3rd century and early 4th century, but exists outside of the walls, not within the city proper. Christians would be buried outside of the city walls, as would the earliest churches dedicated to this new religion would be outside the city walls. It's going to be located in land or property purchased by confraternities or organizations of laymen who pool their resources to do good for the community. Contrary to popular belief, it was protected under Roman law that you could bury your dead and carry out funerary rites as you see fit outside of the city. Therefore, these catacombs that are so famous in early Christianity were not sites for worship, only for funerary practices. Here, the largest of the catacombs is St. Calixtus, where we find a deacon and a rich banker is going to convert to Christianity and is going to be sainted hereafter. Roman law protects these tombs, as it does with all religions outside the city. Now, catacombs are going to be vast subterranean networks of galleries or passageways, coming from the Latin ad catacombus, or in the hollows. Thus, they are cut directly out of the tufa bedrock by a group of grave diggers that specialize in this task. They tunneled out the tufa bedrock just like the Etruscans, but these are less elaborate and more extensive than the Etruscans. We have very shrewd, hollowed out either cubiculum or mortuary chapels, and then loculi or shelf tombs. We have 60 to 90 miles in many of these early Christian catacombs, winding up and down throughout this maze-like quality where Christians are buried, with 4 million bodies accounted for. There are two types of burial spots here in the catacombs. One are loculi, or shelf-like openings for bodies. This is going to be for those of more modest means, where you could barely fit a body in it. The second are cubicula, or mortuary chapels. These are small rooms that function much more like a mausoleum for an entire family. Obviously, a family with money could afford a cubiculum. Here's one of those cubiculum, in which we have a mortuary chapel. You can still see the bones of the early Christians here in these small shelves above. Now, the painting on the ceiling is going to illustrate the Good Shepherd, the story of Jonah and Orance, showing us the earliest way in which Christ is represented. Here, surrounding in a series of 4 lunettes, we have a central image of Christ as shepherd with people praying around the stories of the Old Testament scenes of Jonah. So here we're going to find that people praying are going to lift their hands up. So here we have early Christians praying around Jonah, which is seen to be a prefiguration of Christ. For Jonah is going to be swallowed by a big fish, later translated a whale, and spends 3 days in his belly before being vomited up on shore. Thus you find that, like Christ, he overcomes death after 3 days of darkness. In the lunettes, we have this Old Testament story where he is thrown from a ship, where he emerges from the whale, or this ketos. He's going to be vomited up here. And then he contemplates his miracle. The Orants, of course, praying for salvation themselves. As Christ defeated death, so do they here in this tomb wish to free themselves from death's shackles. The ketos, importantly, is going to carry on that tradition that Romans would be familiar with. Going back to the Areopagus Augusti, these sea creatures are going to be common in Greek and Roman painting and sculpture, for this is what they thought sea monsters looked like. So we're going to be communicating using a language, a visual language that people would be familiar with. We do not come up with new imagery for this new religion. You need to use what already exists to communicate who Christ is, what this new religion is about. And here, with the first way in which Christ is shown as Good Shepherd or teacher, coming from John 10:11, I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd gives his life for his sheep. Here we find an image that people would be familiar with. For we're merely adopting the classical motif of a shepherd who is going to be found in Elysium, and or the word for paradise for the Greco-Roman polytheistic religion. Now we are merely going to be introducing this shepherd into a new context where he retrieves lost sheep or sinners, saving us instead of merely being a passive participant in paradise. Once this religion is approved by the state and is state-sponsored, churches would be built over the catacombs, and they become places of worship. Often the bodies of these early Christians would be moved up to burial chambers and or chapels in churches proper. The wealthy after this time could actually afford stone or lead sarcophagi because, unlike their Roman counterparts, Christians need to be buried whole for their bodies to be resurrected on Judgment Day. Turning to the earliest images of Christ in sculpture, we should note that, for Christianity, monumental sculpture would be rare from the 300s onward. We might ask why, and the answer is quite simple. It would be Justinian Martyr who wrote in his Apologia of the 2nd century that the second commandment forbids graven images. Therefore, pagans, as they saw it, the Romans around them, worship statues of their gods. Therefore, Christians will avoid freestanding, large-scale statuary that looked like these cult statues. However, the converts that were once pagan still needed these statues and were familiar with them and comfortable with them, so they would retain these classical values in rare examples, though only commission statuettes, small statues that could not be mistaken for an actual person. These, of course, are also not painted as naturalistically, but carry on that classical conception of a shepherd who carries his flock, who protects us. And this is the earliest way in which Christianity appeals to the masses. That being, this is a Christ for the people, not for the elite yet. They convert most of those individuals from the lower class and working mercantile class before Christianity will infiltrate and take over the upper class. Here in Christ Seated from Civita Latina, we have another small 2-foot-high statue that shows the second way in which Christ will be known. And this is when we begin converting the aristocrats or patricians. For you do not relate Christ as a low-class shepherd. You want to show how he is like you. And so we now are going to have a Roman philosopher type replacing the shepherd, who is very educated, who has long hair like a philosopher, a thinker, who holds a scroll generally in his left hand and talks to you with a blessing, a benediction, or oratorial pose with his right. He's wearing a tunic and sandals just like a Roman philosopher. And so we can easily, as the upper class now, identify with this version of Christ. He is like us. Now we can see the transition and appeal from the masses to the elite in Rome. And of course, you need to convert the elite for a religion to get state sponsorship and be accepted among the upper class. Now, among these upperclassmen who are converted, we have Unius Bassus, who also would relate to Christ as philosopher and show him as such on his sarcophagi. Now here we have the same subjects that often are going to come up in sculpture, painting, and on sarcophagi. Remember that Christians need to be buried and their bodies remain whole in order to be resurrected on Judgment Day. So here, the Christian convert and prefect of Rome is going to state that there is an inscription, right, and he is baptized just before his death, exactly like Constantine would have been a few decades earlier. Now, through typology, or paralleling the Old and New Testament, we alternate between scenes from the Old Testament and the New. Centered in the middle, we have Christ enthroned between Saints Peter and Paul, the princes of the apostles and patron saints of Rome. And around them, we have various episodes from the Old Testament and from the Passion of Christ. In the center, we can easily see how Romans would associate themselves with this second version of Christ, in which he is seated in the center as a teacher, talking to Peter and Paul. In heavenly triumph over the earth, he steps on a sky god here, who is at his feet. Therefore, Christ is the ruler of the universe. Below him, again, we find Christ on a horseback, which people would associate with, as we talked about last time, with Marcus Aurelius' equestrian monument, would be associated with Roman emperors entering cities, going through triumphal arches, again associating him with images of power that they would be familiar with in ancient Rome. The Roman philosopher type is seen here again, wearing a tunic, a toga, and sandals, holding a scroll in his left hand, teaching or talking to us with his right. This becoming the most common way in which Christ will be shown throughout the Middle Ages. Even if we look at the cuirass and the imagery, we can see how we are continuing that iconography from the Roman tradition, whereby a educated philosopher would be shown with longer curly hair, And we have the same images of the earth, the sky. These allegories would be carried on in the repertoire of these Roman artists who are now working for Christians. In the sacrifice of Isaac, we get a good example of what prefiguration or typology will dominate the iconography of Christianity early on. In it, we have the Old Testament story of Abraham, who is asked to sacrifice his young, miraculous son Isaac, whom his wife Sarah had when she was in her 90s. Therefore, it is a story of a father who sacrifices his son. And of course, this prefigures Christianity in that God will send his son to be sacrificed. Thus, we have exemplars of faith here that parallel Christ himself. Now, Constantine I, nicknamed Constantine the Great, the Caesar of the West, who defeats Maxentius at Milvian Bridge in 312, will issue the Edict of Milan in 313, ending the persecution of Christians, legalizing Christianity. Then, after the Council of Nicaea in 325, he makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Selecting the location for this new monumental structure for a new state religion, we noted that we needed to choose a building that met the requirements of the Christian liturgy, but also choosing a location which would not cause trouble with the established religion. So showing you here where the Pantheon, the Colosseum, and the Forum are on the eastern section of the Tiber River, note that Constantine and Pope Sylvester select a location for this new structure on the west bank of the Tiber River. So most Christian monuments, like their dead and the catacombs, are going to be located outside of the old city walls. Here, Constantine and Pope Sylvester believed that St. Peter was actually buried. Thus, as with Matthew 16:18, they continue that biblical tradition, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Because pietra means stone in Latin, so it is a double entendre. We are building this on top of the body of St. Peter and upon the solid rock of salvation. Obviously, this is not what the original structure looked like, because New St. Peter's was rebuilt after it was knocked down by Julius II in 1506. The older structure, Old St. Peter's as it is known, would have been built between 319 and 390 and would have had many very familiar structures like that of Roman imperial fora. The structure itself was designed to house 3,000 to 4,000 people, hence the structural guiding principles behind it, and the axiom of form follows function is that it must hold a large number of people. Now we find that out front we would enter through a gatehouse into an atrium and move into this timber roof structure that has double side aisles and a central nave, a huge monumental statement of this new religion. The basilica is named for the Roman basilica type, but has one distinct difference. It still continues the organization of the nave, the central longitudinal axis where the laity is going to be located, or the congregation. It also has aisles that flank either side, just like what we looked at last time at Constantine's Basilica at Trier. However, it's going to have a transept which crosses the nave, giving it that distinct Latin cross or T-bar shape. It crosses there, where we find the nave intersecting the transept at the crossing. This is where they believed St. Peter's body to be buried. Therefore, this was not modeled on pagan temples, which are small and only have a cella on the inside for a cult statue. Therefore, only priests are allowed to go into Roman and Greek temples. The decoration is on the exterior of the temples. The opposite is true of Christian churches, for the exteriors are plain and brick facades, whereas the interiors are golden and gleaming with colored marble and mosaics. The reason they are so different is the function. You need the congregation on the inside instead of the outside, directing their attention to the priest on the inside, and reinforcing the division between the priesthood and the laity. Hence, we have the horizontal bar as the definitive breaking point of where the laity should not go. The Roman basilica type, as you can see here, from the Basilica Nova of Constantine, is the same dimensions. And we should, of course, expect that the same masons and architects are working on both structures because they are for the same patron. Therefore, we should have guessed that some of the same designs and the same elements would be carried over. Even the entryway to get into the church is similar to the Forum, which is right next to these structures, right next to the Colosseum. So in the Forum proper, you enter into this large open plaza, very often containing an equestrian monument of the ruler. Now we have a fountain, of course, the promise of eternal salvation and life through the sacrament of baptism. The transept is what is unique in this Christian addition to the Roman basilica type because it literally forms the X marks the spot, forming a crossing where the relics of St. Peter are located, his body, his bodily remains, the first pope. Here we have today that marked with the baldacchino by Bernini, and still the body of St. Peter in his sarcophagus directly below it. Now, the plain exterior is going to belie the richly adorned interior in that this was seen to represent Christians themselves, who are going to be plain on the outside and have a mortal exterior shell. But the bright brilliance of the spirit, their soul, is what matters on the inside. The exterior we can reconstruct by looking to basilicas built around the same time by the same patron, such as the Aula Palentina at Trier. So we note that we have a plain brick facade on the outside. It does not, of course, tell us what is going to happen on the inside. To understand the interior decorations, we need to look at other surviving basilicas from the 4th century, such as St. Paul outside the walls, that, like old St. Peter's, literally was outside of the city walls. In it, we find colored marble. On the floor, we have the composite order capitals, a nave arcade, and golden mosaics decorating the clerestory and the apse, as it represents heaven. A richly ordained and decorated interior space that is appropriate for the house of God, as it's going to biblically be referenced. Now, Rome falls in 410 Common Era with the sack of the Visigoths, led by their king Alaric. At this time, the Western Empire falls to warrior lords, otherwise known as warlords, who carve up the territory that was ancient Rome into smaller and smaller sections. It was during this period in the late 5th century when the historical King Arthur was believed to have existed and fought the Saxons at the disintegration of the empire, not Christianizing them until the 7th century either. However, Rome does survive in the East, and next time we will turn to the Byzantine Empire and the Greek Orthodox tradition that will survive until 1453.